Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the prospects of serious reform of the way MPs are elected to Westminster, proportional representation ideally, and how I think it may be realistically possible, but I suspect in 3 elections' time rather than 2. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news in politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, with Labour's constitutional reform document published yesterday, there's been a lot of talk about reforms of voting systems being missing from the document. Obviously, there are a lot of people who want MPs to be decided using the much fairer and more representative PR system. Not just myself. In fact, polling shows a majority of the public would back this idea right now. We also know that Labour members are overwhelmingly in support, and now too are enough affiliated unions. In terms of Labour formally adopting it as policy, there's a huge benefit. There are a couple of downsides. The benefit is that they can not only achieve more, but defend what they do achieve with PR. With first past the post, Labour enjoy all the power for a little while. Then they let the Tories back in, who smash it all up again. What do we really have from Labour's time in power? The NHS winter crises are back again with a vengeance. Crime rates are through the roof. Real terms pay cuts for public sector workers are the norm. The economy is knackered. The education system's failing to provide the skills we need for businesses. And our very rights and freedoms are being flushed down the toilet. In fact, pretty soon, if you want to find some rights and freedoms, you're going to have to find them floating about in the rivers with the rest of the effluence. With proportional representation, you don't keep the Tories out of power. You just stop all of the power being held by an extreme narrow interest group. The Tories, to win power, would have to work with others. Given that their options would mostly be in the form of progressive parties, their capacity to wreck our national infrastructure as well as rights would be limited. And the Tories would be in this position much less often as well. They would be on the opposition benches more often. You take 2010 for example. Labour lost power after 13 years. They couldn't realistically form a coalition. Gordon Brown tried, but it would have required too many parties. The numbers only realistically allowed for a Conservative Lib Dem coalition, or nothing at all. Now, in my view, we should have had nothing at all, but there it is. But if the seats had been decided by proportional representation, and the votes cast were still the same, Labour and the Lib Dems could have formed a coalition, and it would have had enough of a majority to get things done. The Conservatives would still have been the largest party, and of course, they would have had the right to persuade the Lib Dems to join them to make an even bigger coalition. But the Lib Dems would have had options and at the very least much more bargaining power. There would have been zero excuse to go along with austerity, for example. This would have prevented their collapse of votes in 2015, which then ushered in Brexit. But even if the votes had remained as they were in 2015, with that collapse in Lib Dem support, let's say for some other reason, the Tories still wouldn't have been in a great position. They could have just about cobbled together a government. They absolutely could. But it would have had virtually no majority. It would have needed the likes of UKIP and the DUP in there. And yes, that would mean a pro-Brexit alliance. But because it wouldn't have had really a majority, the increase in the chance of Tory rebellions, therefore, everything, it would have been faced down. So the reality is that PR would never have allowed Brexit or austerity to get off the ground. Now, it's too late to stop those because they've happened, but adopting PR would still mean we avoid the same sort of destructive policies in the future and have an easier job fixing the damage of past mistakes. It's powerfully in Labour's interest to adopt proportional representation. I say this, I am a committed Labour supporter myself. Proportional representation is, for me, the most important reform. Nothing else is more important. Nothing. Because without it, nothing that Keir Starmer or any future Labour leader can achieve will have the legs to withstand their inevitable defeat at some time. You cannot have a long-term strategy based on never losing an election to the Tories again. You know, if you were to say, if I was part of a leadership strategy discussion, which I'm not, if I were, and they were genuinely not thinking about PR, and I was to say to them, so how are you're going to achieve all this, you're going to get all these reforms in, how are you going to make sure they stand the test of time? If your answer is, well, we'll try and just never lose an election again, it's like, it's not realistic, is it? You can't have a strategy like that. But you can have one that works on the basis of preventing the Tories from having one small but noisy clique within their ranks ruling the entire country. So why don't Labour just announce it? Well, there's three main reasons. First is if they were going to announce it at all, so let's say they really were planning to announce it, you wouldn't do it now. It serves no purpose now, doesn't do you any good now, and it only allows opponents to get themselves ready. Much better to spring it on your opponents when they've got just like the few weeks left of a general election campaign to get their arguments in before it's too late. The public already approve, so Labour don't need to build up support, they just need to make sure they don't lose it. You know, they just don't want to give the Tories and the Tory media the oxygen of a policy to justify a campaign against it for longer than necessary. So if Labour were actually planning to introduce PR at the next election, they would absolutely give the impression they were not. Adopting it now would be strategically stupid. The second problem is internal party resistance. Yes, the members and unions are now on board with it, but some politicians quite like having safe seats. With PR, Labour would win more seats in parts of the country where they are normally persona non grata, but it would also mean having Tory MPs in areas that would be unthinkable now. It would mean, for example, a Tory MP in Liverpool. Can you imagine that? And because you have to fight for every vote, it means you find it harder to afford weak candidates. A weak candidate is a drag against you. It's not in a system where you're going to win a large majority anyway. So not being able to afford weak candidates is of course a benefit for the health of a democracy. It's a benefit to society. It's not a benefit to the pompous idiots who like being on the gravy train. And those pompous idiots are influential. But the third reason, and this is why I don't think we'll get PR on the next manifesto, but we might the one after. If Labour promised PR in the manifesto, the next manifesto, and let's say it's not a vote loser, because I actually don't know that. Just because a majority of the public are on board with it, again, I keep trying to say, the majority of the public don't matter in a first past the post system. It's those small number of target voters. What do they think? But let us say it's not a vote loser. Let us say that Labour could adopt it. Let's say it's even vote beneficial. And they win the election. And after 4 or 5 years, they've to put their main policies in place, they then have to prepare to share power because they're not going to win a large majority under proportional representation. They're probably not going to win a majority at all. So they'll have to share power for the following election, even if they're really popular. Now this suits me. I'm happy with that. But if I were a Labour strategist, in all honesty, I'd argue against it. Because if you look at that policy document from yesterday, and I've read much more of it now. In fact, I've read all of it, but I haven't necessarily digested every word. There's a lot in it. It can't all go into the next manifesto. There's too much. And some of it will be really difficult to put into practice. One parliament is not enough time to get everything in place that Labour wants to do. But it should be possible to get things started inside 2 parliaments. So it would make sense for Labour to promise PR in their second manifesto. That way it gives them 2 full parliaments of power. When their popularity may be flagging a bit at the end of that, it then gives them a boost for the 3rd term, for which they'll need cross-party support. And the parties they're likely to work with, they may not be completely on board with what Labour have done, but they'll not be so opposed to it that they'll want to unpick it. You know, because as soon as Labour announced PR as a formal policy, Green voters, Lib Dem voters, they will vote for Labour in Labour's target seats to see it done for the long-term benefit of the party they'd rather support. So why blow that in an election where you think you're going to win anyway? Why not wait for the one after, where it's maybe a little trickier. Besides, you can only manage so much constitutional reform at a time anyway. And more powers to Scotland especially, but also Wales, that is much more urgent to deliver for British Unionists. And Labour is, of course, a unionist party. So in terms of the priority, if Labour think to themselves, we're not just going to be a one-term party here, and for future health of the UK, it's much more important that we give more power to Scotland and Wales, then you prioritise that. You give yourself your PR boost by putting it in the second manifesto to make you more likely to win that second term. More reforms in the second term, then get ready to share power after it. Now, I'm not saying that Labour would do this. I'm certainly not saying this is the likely plan, just because it makes strategic sense to me. What I would say is that Starmer made clear yesterday that he wanted to give power back to where it belongs, and where it belongs, in his view, is not Westminster. You know, he was asked by journalists, you're planning on becoming Prime Minister. Why, as your first active Prime Minister, is it to give a load of power away? Why are you doing that? And he basically said, well, this power doesn't belong in Westminster. You know, this is the opposite of the mindset of an empire builder. This is the opposite of the mentality of someone centralising power because they think they're right about what the country needs and should have the power to deliver it. People who are in favour of first past the post are people who like the idea of having all the power. That is totally at odds with what Gordon Brown and Keir Starmer were saying yesterday. You know, the first past the post is the idea of someone who is happy to have all of the power every now and then. It's what was announced yesterday was the intent of someone who wants to stop a future government from corruptly breaking up the fabric of the nation with a misplaced iron grip. And there's no better way to do that than PR. Even the reforms in yesterday's paper, let's say they were all to be put in place, and that's going to be a tough ask. They wouldn't last with a Conservative government in charge determined to reverse it all. You know, no government can legislate to stop a future government wrecking your legacy if they get the power. So you have to stop them getting that power. Starmer is attempting to pass power from Westminster to other parts of the UK. Now, this will work to an extent. Wales and Scotland have been protected from some of the worst excesses of the Tories, for example. You know, I could argue that Northern Ireland had the opportunity also, but they have their own versions of blinkered ideologues to mess things up. But the House of Commons will always remain the supreme power in the UK as long as the UK lasts. To that end, only PR prevents us getting in the mess of the past decade. So it makes sense for Labour to do this. But it also, unfortunately, makes strategic sense for them to wait until the second Parliament. But there we are, those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.